Get out. I don't give handouts. Who is she? And why does her past shake him to his core? What happens next will change everything. Stay tuned. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun stretched across Fifth Avenue, casting long, elegant shadows on the polished glass storefronts. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly brewed espresso from the cafe across the street, mingling with the faint traces of designer cologne that wafted from well-dressed passers-by. High heels clacked against the pavement, luxury cars purred softly at the curb, and the rhythmic rustle of shopping bags painted a portrait of affluence and ease. Inside Lancaster and Company, the most exclusive boutique in New York, opulence was a way of life. Crystal chandeliers bathed the showroom in a warm glow, their light reflecting off racks of tailored suits and handcrafted leather shoes. The scent of rich mahogany and imported Italian leather filled the air, complementing the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. At the heart of it all stood Nicholas Lancaster, the impeccably dressed owner of the multi-million-dollar fashion empire. With salt and pepper hair slicked back and piercing blue eyes that had assessed the worth of men and fabric alike, Nicholas embodied success. He was a man who built himself from nothing. At least, that's what he told himself. Power suited him, and in his world, there was little patience for weakness. So when the frail woman in tattered clothes hesitated at the entrance, her trembling hands clutching the doorframe, Nicholas barely spared her a glance. She didn't belong here. And he was about to make that very clear. Nicholas Lancaster stood behind the gleaming marble counter, his fingers absently tapping against a ledger detailing the week's sales. Business was good, no, thriving, as it always had under his watchful eye. His store was an institution, a place where only the elite shopped. The kind of people who knew the difference between bespoke and off-the-rack, who understood that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about taste. The bell above the glass door chimed. Nicholas barely glanced up. Another customer, no doubt. But the change in the atmosphere was immediate. A hesitation at the threshold. The usual quiet murmur of affluent shoppers lowered, replaced by whispers, then a ripple of discomfort. Then came the scent, unmistakable. Not of designer perfume or fresh leather, but of the streets. The stale, bitter odor of exhaustion, of someone who had spent too many nights in the cold. Nicholas's gaze snapped up, irritation already curling in his chest. A woman stood in the doorway. Her clothes were in tatters, an oversized coat swallowing her thin frame, its once beige fabric now a grimy shade of brown. Wisps of silver-streaked hair peeked out from beneath a knit cap, and her face, lined, weary, familiar in a way he couldn't place, was set with a quiet determination. She didn't belong here. Not in his store. Nicholas's voice was crisp, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. I'm sorry, but we don't do handouts. The woman flinched. She lifted her chin, though, her eyes scanning the boutique as if searching for something, someone. When she met Nicholas's gaze, something flickered there, something that made his stomach tighten in an odd, unfamiliar way. I'm not looking for a handout, she said, her voice rough but steady. I just wanted to. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Her lips parted as if forming a protest, but Nicholas had already turned away, dismissing her like he would a bad investment. The store's security guard, a burly man named Frank Delaney, stepped forward. He didn't need to say anything. His sheer presence was enough to make most people turn on their heels. The woman hesitated, and then she left. Nicholas exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers against his temples as the door swung shut behind her. A few customers threw him approving glances, a silent nod that he had done the right thing, maintaining the exclusivity of his establishment. But something was off. As the woman vanished down the sidewalk, a strange weight settled in his chest. A weight that refused to lift, even as the day carried on. Who was she? And why had her eyes, those weary, haunted eyes, felt like a memory Nicholas couldn't quite reach? Nicholas Lancaster prided himself on his ability to move on. Unnecessary distractions were bad for business. His mind was a well-oiled machine, calculating numbers, predicting trends, ensuring his empire remained untouchable. And yet, as he sat in his private office that evening, staring out at the city skyline, he couldn't shake her from his thoughts. The woman. Something about her unsettled him, not just the audacity of stepping into his store but the way she had looked at him. As if she had expected something from him. As if she knew him. Nicholas closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips against his temple. He had a benefit gala to attend. The city's elite would be there, including investors whose hands he needed to shake and journalists who would write glowing pieces about his latest expansion. By the time he arrived at the extravagant ballroom of the Lexington Hotel, Nicholas had regained his composure. Champagne flowed, laughter echoed, and he was in his element once more. Until he heard the name. Margaret Sullivan. His body tensed. The name clawed at something deep in his memory, something that didn't quite fit. Tragic, isn't it? A woman beside him murmured. Once one of the most brilliant minds in finance. And now, well, you saw the article, didn't you? Nicholas turned. Excuse me? She tapped her phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off her diamond bracelet. Margaret Sullivan. The woman who went missing 10 years ago after a financial scandal ruined her career. Turns out she's been living on the streets. The air around Nicholas suddenly felt thinner. Margaret Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan. The woman who had once been his mentor. Memories resurface. It hit him like a hammer to the chest. Margaret had been one of the most formidable women in the financial industry. She had taught him everything: how to negotiate, how to recognize opportunity, how to stay ahead in a cutthroat world. But then, seemingly overnight, she had vanished. Rumors swirled. Embezzlement, legal trouble, a high-profile betrayal that left her bankrupt. But Nicholas had been too busy rising through the ranks to dwell on her downfall. And now, after all these years, he had thrown her out of his store like she was nothing. A bitter taste rose in his throat. Why hadn't she said anything? Why hadn't she told him who she was? A search for the past. That night, sleep was impossible. Nicholas sat in his penthouse, scrolling through old articles, piecing together Margaret's fall from grace. The reports painted a grim picture: an insider trading scandal, an arrest that never led to conviction, investors who turned their backs on her. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms had lost everything. Nicholas clenched his jaw. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that he owed her nothing. And yet, as dawn broke over the city, he found himself tracking her down. It didn't take long. Frank, his security guard, had seen which direction Margaret had gone after leaving the store. That led him to a shelter on 14th Street. And that's where he found her, sitting at a long table, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in her frail hands. For the first time in decades, Nicholas felt uncertain. He approached slowly, clearing his throat. Margaret looked up. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, recognition dawned in her weary eyes. Nicholas. Hearing his name in her voice after so many years sent a strange ache through his chest. You remember me, he said quietly. Margaret gave a soft, hollow chuckle. Hard to forget the ones you build. The words hit like a slap. He had admired her once. Looked up to her. And yet, when she fell, he never looked back. What happened to you? His voice was rougher than he intended. Margaret sighed. It's a long story. I have time. She studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the chair across from her. And so, for the first time in a decade, Margaret Sullivan told her story. A truth long buried. She had been set up. Her downfall wasn't just bad luck or poor choices. It was deliberate. A corporate coup. She had trusted the wrong people, let her guard down for just a moment, and it had cost her everything. Her company. Her reputation. Her life. Nicholas felt something twist in his gut. He knew that world too well. He had seen what power-hungry men were capable of. Why didn't you fight back? He asked. Margaret's smile was sad. And who would have believed me? The people I trained were too busy taking my place. Nicholas swallowed. The people she trained. That included him. Suddenly, the weight of his own ambition felt suffocating. Had he, in his hunger for success, been part of the problem? Margaret sipped her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. You know, I never expected anyone to come looking for me. Nicholas exhaled. Neither had he. And yet, here he was. Watching the woman who once ruled boardrooms now fight for a warm meal. and something in him cracked. Nicholas sat across from Margaret, the weight of her story pressing against his chest like a stone. He had always believed himself to be self-made, a man who clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and brilliance. But now, staring into the tired eyes of the woman who had once guided him, he saw his success for what it truly was, built on the foundation Margaret had laid. And when she fell, he hadn't even looked down. Now, fate had put her in front of him once more. And he had kicked her out. The thought made his stomach turn. Margaret took another sip of coffee, her fingers trembling against the ceramic cup. The shelter was bustling now, volunteers passing out breakfast, the low murmur of conversation filling the room. This was her life now. And he had the power to change it. But would she even let him? Would she even want his help? Nicholas exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He could write her a check, a simple solution. But the more he thought about it, the more it disgusted him. That wasn't what she needed. That wasn't enough. Margaret Sullivan had built empires. She had shaped the industry. And now, the very world she had once dominated had discarded her. Nicholas wasn't sure if he was too late. But he had to try. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Come with me." Margaret frowned. "Come with you where?" Nicholas hesitated. How could he explain it? That he wanted to make things right? That he owed her everything and had never realized it until now? "I don't belong in your world anymore, Nicholas," Margaret said before he could speak. "You built that world," he shot back. "And I refuse to believe you don't belong in it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Nicholas straightened in his seat. "Come with me," he repeated, stronger this time. "I have a meeting today, an investment summit. Some of the biggest players in the industry will be there. People who used to admire you. People who," he exhaled, "who turned their backs on you just like I did." Margaret shook her head. "You don't get it. These people, their memory is short when it comes to redemption. The moment I step into that room, they'll either ignore me or tear me apart." "Then let them," Nicholas said. "Because this time, you won't be standing alone." Margaret's gaze locked onto his. A battle raged within her. She had spent years surviving, shrinking herself down, convincing herself she was irrelevant. And now, Nicholas, the boy she had mentored, the man who had once been her protégé, was offering her a hand. A hand she wasn't sure she had the strength to take. But deep down, something flickered. Something long buried. The fire that had once driven her. She set down her coffee. "Fine," she murmured. "Let's go." Nicholas's black town car pulled up in front of the glass-covered high-rise where the investment summit was being held. A valet opened the door, and Nicholas stepped out first. Then Margaret. The whispers started immediately. Eyes widened. Lips curled. Some attendees stole discreet glances, others were less subtle. Margaret kept her posture straight, but Nicholas could see the tension in her shoulders. "Stay close to me," he murmured. They entered the grand ballroom. A sea of silk suits, expensive watches, and perfectly curated facades. Then a voice, sharp, mocking. "Well, look who decided to show her face." Nicholas turned. Gregory Hale. Once a competitor, now a smug-faced CEO who had been one of the men who benefited from Margaret's downfall. Margaret's jaw tightened. Gregory's gaze flickered to Nicholas. "And here I thought you had better company these days, Lancaster." Nicholas stepped forward, his voice cold as steel. "Careful, Hill. You're speaking to a woman who's still twice the strategist you'll ever be." Gregory chuckled. "Is that so?" He turned to Margaret. "Tell me, how's life on the streets treating you?" A hush fell over the surrounding guests. Eyes darted between them, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. Nicholas clenched his fists. "Margaret?" She smiled. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. Commanding. "I don't know, Gregory. How's life treating you knowing you'll never be anything more than a footnote in someone else's success?" A beat of silence. Gregory's face twisted, but before he could fire back, Nicholas let out a short laugh. "I wouldn't waste your time, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying through the ballroom. "Gregory here has spent his whole career trying to be important. And you just reminded him why he never will be." The ripple of chuckling that followed was soft but deadly. Gregory's face burned red. Margaret lifted her chin. And for the first time in 10 years, she felt something she thought she'd lost. Power. The whispers continued, but they were different now. Margaret wasn't some discarded relic. She was a woman who had survived. Nicholas turned to her. "There's an opening on my executive board," he said quietly. "I want you on it." Margaret inhaled sharply. "Not out of pity," he added before she could protest. "But because I need you. My company is thriving, but I want it to be something more. Something better. And I can't do that without you." Margaret searched his eyes. No arrogance. No charity. Just a man trying to make things right. She exhaled. "On one condition." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Margaret's gaze swept the room. "We don't just build something for the rich." She turned back to him. "We build something for the ones who never got a second chance." A slow smile spread across Nicholas's face. "Deal." And just like that, Margaret Sullivan stepped back into the world that had tried to erase her. This time, she would not be forgotten. The murmurs in the grand ballroom had shifted. Where once there had been whispers of mockery and doubt, now there was curiosity and intrigue. Margaret Sullivan, the woman who had been erased from the industry, had just reclaimed her seat at the table. And the industry was watching. As Nicholas escorted her to the main conference hall, a few familiar faces approached. Some were genuine, offering quiet words of respect. Others were opportunists, sensing that Margaret's return could shift the balance of power in ways they hadn't anticipated. Margaret handled it all with grace, the same calculated presence she had once commanded in boardrooms. But Nicholas saw the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. And he wouldn't let her stand alone. "Let's take it slow," he murmured as they reached the hall's entrance. "We're not here to impress them. We're here to prove that they should have never counted you out." Margaret glanced up at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. Then, with a slow nod, she stepped forward into her future. News spread fast. By the time the summit concluded, social media was buzzing. Margaret Sullivan's name was back in circulation. Articles speculating on her return, interviews resurfacing her past successes, discussions questioning whether she had been wrongfully cast out in the first place. The narrative was changing. And Nicholas? He wasn't just a bystander. His public support of Margaret cemented his own transformation. The cutthroat businessman who had once turned a blind eye to the fallen was now a force for redemption. Some called it risky. Others called it calculated. But Nicholas knew the truth. It was necessary. Over the next few weeks, Margaret settled into her new role, an advisory position on Nicholas's executive board, with full autonomy to shape his company's ethical and social initiatives. It wasn't just about profit anymore. It was about responsibility. One of her first initiatives? A financial literacy program for struggling individuals, especially those who, like her, had been discarded by the system. "I don't want to just rebuild my own life," she told Nicholas one evening in his office. "I want to build a bridge for others who were left behind." Nicholas simply nodded. Because for the first time in his career, he understood that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used for something greater. Margaret also had unfinished business. One by one, she confronted the people who had orchestrated her downfall. Some denied their involvement. Others tried to justify it. And a few? They couldn't even look her in the eye. But Margaret wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking acknowledgement. And she got it. The industry's power players were realizing that Margaret Sullivan was not just a relic of the past. She was the future. And this time, they wouldn't be able to erase her. 6 months later, Margaret Sullivan stood at the glass window of her new office, overlooking the bustling streets of New York. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. The industry had tried to erase her, but she had rewritten the story. And she hadn't done it alone. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Nicholas stepped in, a folder in hand. The final approvals for the Second Chance initiative just came through. Margaret turned, a slow smile spreading across her face. The Second Chance initiative, her first major project at Nicholas's company, was an incubator program that provided funding, mentorship, and employment opportunities for individuals who had been cast out of their industries due to unforeseen circumstances, financial struggles, or systemic failures. People like her. People who had been forgotten. Nicholas leaned against the desk. This is going to change lives. Margaret nodded. That's the goal. She took the folder, flipping through the documents. Each page represented a new beginning for someone who had been left behind. Margaret had once thought her story was over. Now she realized it had only just begun. Later that evening, Margaret walked through the streets of Manhattan, the cool air brushing against her skin. She passed the old corner where she had once slept in the cold, where people had stepped over her like she was invisible. And now, she was walking toward a future she had reclaimed. A small diner stood on the corner. Margaret hesitated, then stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed as she walked up to the counter. "Coffee, please," she said, sliding a few bills forward. The young barista, probably no older than 20, looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "Rough night?" he asked as he poured her drink. Margaret glanced around at the other patrons. Some were businessmen, others looked like they had just finished a long shift at work. And in the corner, an elderly man sat alone, his coat worn and his hands trembling. Margaret recognized the look in his eyes, the same quiet defeat she had once carried. She grabbed her coffee, then pulled out a few extra bills, sliding them toward the barista. "For his meal," she said, nodding toward the old man. The barista hesitated, then smiled. "That's kind of you." Margaret simply nodded. It wasn't kindness. It was understanding. Because she had been there. And someone had given her a second chance. Now it was her turn. As she stepped back onto the street, Margaret thought about everything that had happened. The rise. The fall. The painful years in the dark. And the moment when someone finally saw her again. Life wasn't just about how high you could climb. It was about who you lifted up along the way. Margaret had spent years believing she was forgotten, that once society deemed you irrelevant, there was no way back. But now she knows the truth. No one is ever truly lost. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to reach out their hand and say, "I see you. I believe in you. And your story isn't over yet." How many times have we walked past someone in need and assumed they were beyond saving? What if, just for a moment, we chose to see them instead? What if we became the person who offered a second chance? Because sometimes, the difference between a life rebuilt and a life lost is just one act of compassion.